You have been seeing slides that were put together by wonderful Heather here, who works with the Center for Human Rights and International Justice. And the music is, some of you may know it, La Otra Llamada del Rio, Quinteto Tiempo, written in 1977 by El Canto del Pueblo de Argentina, and played in San Salvador on multiple occasions, including when they carried the bodies of the Jesuits through the streets of San Salvador. And it's put together on our website with a video by our colleagues in Argentina. So we are delighted to have you here on Brinton Lakes. And Tomeo will get us started.
Okay. Okay, welcome. Good night, everybody. My name is Tomeo Stolrich. I'm the director of the Center for Ignatian Spirituality here at Boston College. Well, thanks for being here virtually and in person, despite this awful weather, okay? So early this year, the movie What Lucia Saw, Llegaron de Noche, was presented on the 25th Malaga Film Festival in the south of Spain. Since that day, March 21st, 2022, Brinton Lakes and myself has been behind that movie, which still, by the way, is not, it has not been released yet in the United States. And I can tell you one thing, it has been an odyssey, both fun and utterly frustrating. But we made it, so we get the movie, and it really was difficult. Okay. Thanks to the fact that we got that movie, the centers and initiatives that both Brinton and myself represent decided to put together a panel about the topic that we believe captures the essence of the movie and the events that the movie portrays, seeking truth with justice, and hence the title for tonight. For reason of time, we are not going to be able to watch the entire movie. It's simply too long. However, we will see 3 excerpts of it. One clip from the beginning of the movie, contextualizing the events that happened in El Salvador 33 years ago. Another one from the middle section of the movie, portraying Lucia's being coerced and her struggle to tell the truth. And the final cut of the movie showing the actual assassination of the martyrs of El Salvador on November 16, 1989. So now let me say a few words about the panelists. The panelists tonight are 3 wonderful people with very different personalities who, despite that, share 3 important common denominators. First, their passion for Central America and the events that the movie reflect. Second, their emotional and existential connection and even personal relation to the people portrayed in the movie. And third, the fact that seeking truth with justice is not just an accessory part of their calling as human beings and scholars, but an essential part. Ernesto Neto Valiente is Associate Professor of Systemic Theology at the School of Theology and Ministry at Boston College. Born in Santa Ana, El Salvador, Neto knows firsthand the events that are gathering us here tonight. Prior to receiving his PhD in theology from the University of Notre Dame, he earned a BA in economics from Tulane University and a master's in theology from the Western Jesuit School of Theology. Of importance for today's talk is the title of his doctoral dissertation, Truth, Justice, and Forgiveness, Reconciliation in the Christology of John Sobrino, one of the Jesuits who was not assassinated that night. Father Francisco de Rue, SJ, is this year's Gasson Professor at Boston College and a Colombian Jesuit, priest, economist, and philosopher. He's the founder of the Magdalena Medio Development and Peace Program, Colombia's first peace laboratory, and was the director of CINEP, Centro de Investigación y Educación Popular in Bogotá. He's the president of the Commission for the Clarification of Truth, Coexistence, and not repetition in Colombia. He met Ignacio Martín Baró personally several times before his assassination. Brinton Likes is professor of community cultural psychology at the Lynch School of Education and Human Development, a board member of several NGOs, including Women's Rights International, Impunity Watch, and Grassroots International, and co-director of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice at Boston College, and the Ignacio Martín Baró Initiative for Wellbeing and Human Rights, Grassroots International. She also met Ignacio Martín Baró several times, and judging for her pictures with him, those moments were remarkably warm and fun. Thanks to all of you for being here and participating in this panel. And we will start with our first clip.
First, I want to thank you, all of you, for being here in this stormy night. So, and I am going to apologize to you because I'm going to read. By reading, I can be more concise and more precise because we don't have a lot of time, and I want to respect time too. So this first scene that you see goes back to November 1989 with, and it captures the final offensive of the guerrilla forces, the FMLN, okay, against the Salvadorian government during the 12-year civil war. In this brief introduction, I would like to do two things. One, I would like to give you some context about the movie by explaining in very bold strokes, very big strokes, the causes of the civil war in El Salvador. And secondly, I would like to explain the role of the Jesuit University, the UCA, okay, during this very difficult period. The roots of the Salvadorian Civil War lie in two interrelated factors. One, the historical inequality of the country's socioeconomic system and the illegitimate character of the political system that preserved it. Broadly speaking, thank you very much. Broadly speaking, the disparity of the Salvadorian society is a product of the unequal distribution of land and wealth that emerged first from the Spanish colonial system and later from the economic model based on the production and exportation of agricultural products. Since the 19th century, this had centered on coffee. The acute inequality inherent in the country's socioeconomic system has historically benefited and supported a wealthy white minority, that is, an oligarchy, who enjoy the lifestyle similar to that of the people of the developed countries, just like here in the United States. While most other Salvadorians experience chronic unemployment, wretched housing, deficient nutrition, inadequate medical and educational services, and generally subhuman living conditions. For the greater part of the last century, and I'm talking 50 years, the military dictators governed the nation with the blessing of the wealthy oligarchy. And thus, they chart the country's development and direction. In the 1970s, after decades of fraudulent elections and increasing political repression, people gave up on the electoral system, and they began to affiliate with different types of revolutionary organizations: union workers, peasants, students, teachers, and the marginalized population joined political popular organizations to bring to the streets the grievances of the population at large. As political tensions deepen, the level of violence increased, and that's what you see in the scene, okay? The government responds to the claim of these popular organizations with repressive measures, widespread torture, assassinations, and the disappearance of popular leaders. In response to the state violence, leftist guerrilla groups were formed to defend the population and to confront the military forces. In fact, by 1980, the leftist guerrilla group and their popular organizations coalesced around the Farabundo Martí of National Liberation, the FMLN, and they readied themselves for civil war. This is the group that the interrogator is accusing Ellacuría to be a member of in the scene that you just saw. Then, with the assassination of Monsignor Romero in 1980, El Salvador entered into an spiral of violence. And by the end of the year, a full-scale civil war erupted between the government and the FMLN. The conflict spread rapidly, and by 1985, it had claimed around 50,000 lives. By the end of the war in 1992, more than 75,000 Salvadorians had died in the conflict. But what about the university? What about the UCA during this period? The Jesuit University was founded in 1965 to train professionals who go on to strengthen the status quo and to foster the slow transformation of the nations through economic development, slow progress. Indeed, the wealthy benefactors who approached the Jesuit fathers about founding the university saw the establishment of the UCA as a safe Catholic alternative to the national university, which in the eyes of the benefactors had fallen prey to the dangers of secularism, to the dangers of Marxism. Yet, in light of the widespread injustice and under the leadership of Father Ignacio Ellacuría, the UCA shifted its position from just serving the wealthy families to focus on the inequalities and injustice experienced by the population at large. In a manner of speaking, after the assassination of Monsignor Romero, the UCA became the conscience of the Salvadorian society. As the civil war unfolded, the UCA emerged as a voice of accountability and reason. From the beginning of the conflict, the university maintained that a military solution could not successfully overcome the national conflict. Thus, it actively worked for a negotiated alternative to the violence. The university sought to ground these negotiations in sound information. Hence, while newspapers, unions, political parties, and most institutions of society, most institutions in civil society were shutting down because of the war, the university strengthened its outreach to the Salvadorian population. Let me give you some examples. In 1981, the UCA created the Center for Information, Documentation, and Research to keep a reliable account in the events of the country. In 1985, they found the Human Rights Institute to document and report the extensive human rights violations. In 1986, the UCA created the University Public Opinion Institute to conduct polls that truly reflected the will and concern of the population. All this during a civil war. Through its academic journals and magazines and through its public statements, the UCA confronted the agenda of the oligarchy and denounced the repressive policies of the state. while at the same time criticize the violent tactics of the guerrilla forces. It is important to note that UCA never took the side of the government or the side of the FMLN, but dedicated its efforts to stand in solidarity with the Salvadorian population at large. The UCA rationale for this independence went deeper than mere academic freedom. The university leaders were motivated by their Christian faith, particularly their Christian call to stand in solidarity with the poor and the oppressed population. Of course, this prophetic stance incurred the wrath of the right-wing paramilitary forces, which placed bombs in the installations of the school more than 10 times. Ultimately, the efforts of the university were cut short on November 16, 1989, when the Salvadorian military forces forced its way into the Jesuit residence of the UCA and killed the Jesuit priest and their 2 assistants. The movie then tells the story of Lucia Barrera, the woman who witnessed the military inside the university. The movie is about her story. Thank you.
I'm very grateful to have the opportunity of participating in this conversation, because I remember very well Nacho, Ignacio Ellacuría, when he came to Bogota to deepen his studies on psychology at the Javeriana University. It was about 1964, 1965, 1967. We were in the same place in the Eclesiásticas of the Javeriana University, the Faculty of Theology and Philosophy, and also the other faculties of the Javeriana University. And I learned from him because we were already working on social issues and confronting the tensions and the contradictions in Colombia, that we have to center ourselves in the feeling and the suffering of the victims and be very careful to the truths that came directly from the victims. He told us that that was the first truth. You have to go not only to support the victims, but to feel the way they are feeling. The threat. When you see, for instance, here, Lucia, the first point that we have to pay attention to is the way she lived the moment where the Jesuits were murdered. She saw through a window what was going on, and her situation was the suffering in many, many ways. Threat, fear, indignation, sadness, because they were the support for her, they were the stability, they were family, they were all that she had. And suddenly she realized that they were killed. She was afraid that went immediately to the rector of the university, telling him, mataron a los padres, they had murdered the priests, and the one who made the first witness in El Salvador before being taken to Miami and to the FBI or IBF and being treated the way you see. So my first point is to insist in this sort of basic truth, the suffering of the victims, that doesn't need any sort of interpretation. Human suffering, deep human suffering, something that we have to take into consideration always in these moments. And this was always the reference of Ignacio. The other part, you see the liars are the government of El Salvador. The liars are the perpetrators, the military. The liars are the ambassadors of the United States. And they are the liars because they really are afraid of truth. They know that if the witness, the testimony of Lucia prevailed, this is going to be a threat for them, a threat for the military in El Salvador, a threat for the United States that have been supporting the military in El Salvador in the way they are destroying human rights there, as in many other places in Latin America. On the other part, you see Lucia, she is not a liar. She's forced in a brutal way to change her witness, her testimony. And they do that because they really need in some way to oppress her and to confuse her, that she finally thinking in her family, in her daughter, she understood they don't want truth. They just want me telling them that I didn't see anything. We are going to see that after me in the other part of the film. But Lucia recovered herself immediately. A liar tried to be consistent with the lies she had done or he had done. Lucia immediately will recognize that she was forced to say something that destroys her profoundly, his spirituality, her as a human being. We have, on the other part, we have Father Ellacuría. Ignacio Ellacuría was the leader, the intellectual leader of all my companions in Central America. He was a philosopher and he was a theologian. He was a sociologist, and he was, for all of us, the person of great clarity and his extreme decision to confront injustice in Central America. Obviously, they were looking for Ignacio. They wanted to kill Ignacio. Ignacio was a problem for them. That is also another point that really impressed me in this history of Lucia. Finally, she will invite us to reconciliation. And this is very impressed on her. And I have to say that because victims like Lucia have an immense spiritual power, an immense authority. When a victim like her not only sustain the truth in the middle of all the difficulties, but also invite people to forgiveness, transform totally the way we confront the situation like this. I really invite you also, and for the conversation, to take all this history personally. I mean, this is something that we are confronted with today here in the United States, in Central America, in Latin America, in Colombia, my country. I'm coming after 10 million survivors in Colombia and 800,000 people killed because of the war. And after listening thousands and thousands of expressions of witness of victims in my country. But we have to see that war, any war, anywhere in the world is always bad. War never get to any clear solution for nobody. And truth is the first victim in the war. So I hope we can discuss about that the rest of the afternoon.
Later. It was the morning of November the 16th here at Boston College that Ramsey Leem and Joan Leem and I were gathered in an office here with the plans to be in communication with a community of resistance that we as psychologists had been forming since we met Ignacio Martín Baró in Cuba in 1987. And that community of resistance was in El Salvador, Guatemala, Chile, and Argentina. Psychologists and human rights workers and advocates who sought to follow in the footsteps of Nacho Martín Baró, who had been articulating what he and others were calling a psychology of liberation. And that psychology of liberation is yoked to the notion of seeking truth with justice. He argued that psychologists and psychology are challenged towards a new direction, or what he called a new horizon, that we need to focus on the majority population rather than on scientism or social status, as you've heard a little bit about the university there. We had to develop a new understanding of how knowledge was created from below. Lucia Serna is an example of a woman whose story, a story that has antecedents to what we see in this film. She was raised in poverty in El Salvador, in the type of poverty that Neto described briefly. She experienced sexual violence. Her first two children were stolen from her by her first husband. And yet she put one foot in front of the other and moved roughly forward and began working at the university, describing it as the place where she experienced human dignity. That Nacho Martín Baró, that Eyacu experienced a relationship with her through which she experienced her own dignity. Martín Baró called us towards what he said was a new praxis, transformative actions. And that requires that we recover historical memory, that we de-ideologize our everyday experiences, and that we draw on people's virtues. And tonight we are celebrating the virtue of Lucia Serna. And we are also reminding ourselves that the realities that Neto described were able to persist for so long because, as we heard briefly, the United States was deeply involved in El Salvador in the 1980s. The United States and El Salvador called themselves allies. And what that meant was the United States was sending between $1 and $2 million a day to El Salvador. And it was training Salvadoran military, the Acatal Battalion, who were accused of these assassinations that you just saw, were trained here in the United States at the School of the, what was then called the School of the Americas. So we, those of us who are United Statesians, need to recover our history and de-ideologize the stories that we're told about what our government is doing, because the kinds of relationships that we see here that were in El Salvador in the 1980s are the relationships that we are experiencing today in the 21st century. So one of the legacies of the work of the Jesuits is in what we call the Martín Baró Initiative for Well-Being and Human Rights. It's a very small group of volunteers. We're always looking for more volunteers, so you're welcome to join us, that continue to support projects in the Global South, such as the ones you saw on the slides at the beginning of our event, and you'll see again at the end of our event, connected to Grassroots International, another nonprofit. So we commemorate this event each year, in part to remember the people who are critically important in our lives, but as importantly, to be challenged to live our lives seeking truth with justice, and to be challenged to locate this university as a challenge to the lies that are promoted by our government and promoted by scientific and scientific knowledge systems. So thank you all very much for being here. And we now have time for some questions from you and from our Zoom partners who might have beaten you to it. Comments, reactions, questions. You can direct them to anyone or you can direct them. Yes.
I have a simple one. Why was
Dorothy.
the colonel prosecuted in Spain rather than anyplace else?
Oh, that colonel was not prosecuted in Spain, but Montano was prosecuted in Spain. He hid out here in the United States for many years. He lied on his application for entry into the United States. Actually, he hid out very much in this neighborhood. And
In Boston?
in Boston and Rhode Island, and he was identified after many years, and he was deported. But the Salvadoran government has refused to try these people in El Salvador, and the Jesuits in El Salvador have pushed actually hard.
He's protected by the military in El Salvador. The military right now, they have moved back. They play a very important role for 50 years. They move back. I mean, move back in the sense that they are not actively involved, but they still hold a lot of power. So the government felt uncomfortable about bringing that person to justice. There is another general that was, because of the Spanish, brought him to justice, and that's General Ponce. And lately, there are some indications that the former president Cristiani might have known about this. But this is still early. It's been 33 years, but it's still early to make a judgment on that.
It's
For
also
them.
really important to know that, and if you were to watch the film, the longer film, you'll see that the ambassador, William Walker at the time in El Salvador, promised that Lucia would have safe passage to the United States. But it was actually the embassies of France and of Spain who actually intervened to protect her for a night in El Salvador. And the US government actually sent the FBI and a member supposedly it was someone who was from the diplomatic corps, but in fact, it was someone who was from immigration that was in Mexico, who rode the plane to Miami. And instead of turning them over to the Jesuits, which was what was supposed to happen, they were turned over to the FBI, which is where these interrogations took place. And you notice that the man who was introduced as a doctor in the interrogations was actually a part of the Salvadoran military, who was sent through the United States to Miami. So not only did the US fund the war, but they also were complicit in trying to ensure that there be no witness and that there be no testimony. And this film has taken many, many years to bring this story. Lucia has actually told her story to a colleague, Joe Denofa, and written a book called Verdad, in which she tells the details of her life and the story that you see in the film.
There is another point that I know very well in Colombia, and I have the experience with it. If you persecute a man like Ponce is the military leader. If the government do that, if the United States do that, Ponce will speak. And Ponce will point to the other military and the government and the relationship he knows. So they prefer a person like this, not to prosecute them. And they do that everywhere. Because this is a connection and many people involved. And they have managed just to persecute what we call the trigger men. Not
Not the intellectual yeah. People who pull the guns, but not the people who make the guns. But the Spanish cases are because of something called universal jurisdiction, which allows them to be able to prosecute some cases. Dan.
I want to raise another part of this. I completely agree with everything that everybody has said, but it strikes me that part of the answer to your question has to do with one of the most devastating aspects of this horrible story is the lack of justice and the impunity and the feeling that people have not wanting to engage with this story because it's so overwhelming to think they actually got away with it. There's been no justice. And I think that piece of searching for justice, together with compassion and company, all these other things, truth. But I think the justice piece is incredibly important, and it's not over. I mean, the German government, I think, and NGOs in Europe are now collecting testimony of Holocaust survivors all over. The average age is 87 years, but they're collecting it. People are still being prosecuted for crimes that took place in the 1940s. So I think part of the motivation that could be inspiring to people is to think about ways that justice can exist, and that moment of universal jurisdiction in Spain, which was a temporary phenomenon and still being fought over, is an example of how courts can play a role here that can empower people and give witnesses the sense that their testimony matters, and give us the sense that, you know, as they say, the arc of the universe does bend toward justice. That's what we want to believe, and in this case, it's very hard to believe it because.
But it is in
such a
fact the case. The Center for Justice and Accountability here in California is still deeply involved in this case. There are lawyers and expert witness Terry Carl from Stanford University has testified in a variety of court cases. So thank you for bringing up that issue. So there are ways of being involved in that press for justice, but it is a long-term solution. And my own experiences working here, I once worked with a student who was a scholar of the college. And he said to me, Professor Leitch, you don't understand people like me. And I said, I said he was right. I didn't understand that. But what did he have in mind? I said, he said, you want me to get involved in things that take a lifetime to change. And I want to see results next week. And I want to know that I am responsible for the results that I see. And I think that we in the United States are socialized into exceptionalism and the fact that we can make change and that we can make it as individuals, which personally I think we can't, but I do think we can make it in community. I think we can make it through social movements. I think we can make it through organizing. But that takes time and energy. And when I was 17, 18, I thought I was going to see the revolution in France. I was living in Paris when the students shut down the schools and the workers shut down the city. And I thought, I'm going to be part of the revolution. And here I am, anxious that my grandnieces and nephews are being left a world that's worse than the one I inherited when I was 17 or 18. Because of the fact that change is slow, change takes a long time. I don't usually recommend therapy to people, but I often do when I want people to understand how hard it is to change anything. Because if you've ever been in counseling or therapy and you've tried to change a little thing about yourself, like, could I please be more polite to my mom or not slam the phone down when I get angry at it? And you understand why you do that, and you practice not doing it, but you still do it when you get angry, as opposed to meditating, or breathing deeply, or whatever else you might do besides slamming down the phone and Zoom. So legal systems are one way to make change. Organizing social movements, community as resistance. There's a wonderful woman who, Lorcia Pena, who didn't get tenure at Harvard, but she's a professor at Tufts University, and she wrote a brilliant book called Community as Resistance, a syllabus for women of color in the academy, about how to organize to resist the kinds of failure to understand history and needing more energy for resisting.
Did something, in response to what you said too, as I was sitting and listening to this. I was recalling that usually, few months after the kids were killed, I had the privilege of going to El Salvador with my father. We went into Luga, there were still mobile phones in the wall. And the Jesuit told us about what happened. It was very moving. The place was still a wreck. And after that, we went to, I think it was the U.S. consulate, and spoke to whoever was head there. My father asked about doing some business in El Salvador. My father, by the way, was a big Republican. But he knew that he'd been told the truth about the assassination of the Jesuits. So he said to this man, representing the US government, well, this is the same place to invest. Look at what just happened to the Jesuits and these women who worked with them. And this man from the United States, a very high official, lies in my father's face and says the guerrillas did it. So, listening about doing justice later, who's going to do justice about the United States officials who told these lies and helped fund the killer and train her? And if we want to know about the things we do now, we can know that when we, those of us who can vote, should look into the international politics of the people who are running this country and not be naive and think that we're spreading good everywhere. It's much more complicated than that. And it's our duty as voters to know about this and not to worry about how we can vote.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
¿Por qué me preguntas, compañera? ¿Dónde fui con mi sangre si lo sabes? Es que el río llamaba, una sola esperanza nos decía adelante, adelante. Shabadabda, bam, shabadabda, bam, por vos, mujer, por nuestro sueño, pa, 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 que cargue en mi pecho el estandarte. Es que el río llamaba, una sola esperanza nos decía adelante, adelante. Pero ellos triunfaron sin pena ni gloria. El sal silencia y huye a la sombra del río Coral que inundó las calles y gloria cantaba diciendo adelante, dame tu ternura en este día, que la calma huele a tempestades y la lucha es larga, el río está llamando y nos dice adelante, adelante, adelante.
Adelante, compañera, salgamos a la calle, no nos entreguemos y hagamos que esto ande.
Adelante.